So in this video, I want to argue that most Christians are wrong in an important sense about the doctrine of sanctification, and I want to explain why that matters. So to begin with, let's talk about the Ordo Salutis. It's a fancy Latin term which means the order of salvation. Let's talk about the Protestant version of the order of salvation for simplicity's sake. It has two big parts to it. The one part is the part that it's more punctiliar. It's like an event. It involves conversion, regeneration, justification, and union with Christ. This is the beginning point of the story of salvation according to this standard narrative. And from that point, that event flows the next step, which is called sanctification. So, more in maybe more familiar language, justification is the event, sanctification is the process that follows the event. And I believe that this is importantly wrong in the following way, that sanctification is not simply something that follows an event of justification, union with Christ, conversion, and regeneration, but rather something that also precedes it. Sanctification is becoming more like Christ, being conformed to the image of God in Christ. And the fundamentally errant idea that so many Christians have is that sanctification only begins at conversion, at regeneration, at union with Christ, when in fact it is something that continues throughout our lives. Now, here's why I argue that this is the case, but simply. Put it simply, it's because to be sanctified is to be more like Christ, and to be more like Christ is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So, to the degree that you are moving, increasing in the love of neighbor, you are to that degree being sanctified, being conformed to Jesus Christ. And that can happen whether you are a professing Christian or not, whether you've quote unquote been justified, converted, regenerated, and had union with Christ or not. It can still occur. Sanctification can occur. Think about Mark 9:38 to 41. Teacher, said John, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. Do not stop him, Jesus said, for no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me. For whoever is not against us is for us. Truly, I tell you, whoever you give a cup of water to in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not lose their reward. So Jesus there is saying, look, it's not about being in the tribe. It's about what are the actions you are doing in my name. Now, a person might say, oh, but my name, doesn't that entail or require a conversion? Well, think about the words of Jesus again in Matthew here, 25, verses 37 to 40. This is in the midst of the parable of the sheep and the goats. The righteous answer him and they say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So here are people who are surprised to find out that they are in fact sheep, but they have been sanctified throughout their lives. In fact, they were the whole time being sanctified insofar as they were doing these works of mercy to their neighbor. They were loving the neighbor as themselves, which again is definitional for what it is to be conformed to Jesus or to be sanctified in Jesus. Now, some people will say, yeah, but here Jesus refers to doing it for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. And brothers and sisters always mean his disciples. Be careful here. In Matthew 12, Jesus says, starting in verse 48, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. The definition, again, for being the disciple of Jesus and being conformed to him, being sanctified in him, is that you are doing his will. And if you are loving your neighbor as yourself, you are being a brother, sister, mother to Jesus. So, sanctification is not simply something that begins when you are converted, regenerated, having union with Christ, some event. Sanctification is what happens as any human being is to a certain degree moving into further conformity to Jesus by loving their neighbor. Loving your neighbor brings you into conformity to Jesus, and that is sanctification. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter that sanctification is not something that simply starts post conversion, regeneration, justification, but rather something that continues throughout our life and may precede a conversion event by decades, simply by people beginning to love their neighbors more as themselves? Why does that matter? It matters because it opens up our eyes to see the degree to which God's kingdom is found not simply in the professing church, and often I would say even contrary to the professing church. God's kingdom can be found anywhere that people are continuing to move more fully into their love of neighbor. And I want to conclude with a stanza, the final stanza from the Gerard Manley Hopkins poem As Kingfishers Catch Fire. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace that keeps all his graces, his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is. Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Christ plays in 10,000 places. Wherever people are moving more fully into their love of neighbor and service to neighbor and honoring of neighbor and care for neighbor, to that degree, they are being conformed to God in Christ and they are being sanctified.